Welcome to another installation of the African American Legacy Preaching Series. I am Dr. Courtney Buggs at Princeton Theological Seminary, Director of the PhD program in African American Preaching and Sacred Rhetoric. It is my pleasure today to welcome the pastor of St. Paul's Baptist Church in the heart of Philadelphia, the Reverend Dr. Leslie Callahan. Welcome to CTS.
Thank you so much.
We are going to spend just a little bit of time getting to know you today, so I want to invite you to just introduce yourself to those who may not know who Reverend Callahan is.
So I am Leslie Callahan, Leslie Dawn Callahan, Leslie Dawn to the people who have known me forever. And I am the pastor of the St. Paul's Baptist Church. I'm the 5th pastor and the first female pastor. I'm celebrating 15 years in that role.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. It's, this very weekend is the anniversary of my preaching my candidacy sermon.
Nice.
So I am from West Virginia. I was raised in West Virginia in the coal fields, played in coal bins. I am the daughter of a man who was a lifelong member of the United Mine Workers Association, a union man. My mother was a church woman. She was a lay person, but deeply committed to both our own congregation, which was Apostolic Temple in Gary, West Virginia, and she was also an ecumenical church woman. She worshiped wherever with all sorts of people. She loved God, she loved church. Our family were deeply committed to the church I grew up in. First my Uncle Jim and then my Uncle John were the pastors who were pastoring when I was growing up. So I think of myself as lots of things, a West Virginian, a church woman. I'm privileged to be a pastor. I'm the mom of an 11-year-old whose name is Annabelle. She goes by Bella when I'm talking to her, and she has other derivatives that she prefers when she's at school. And I guess I'm a preacher. And a preacher is a part of my identity. So I think that's a good start for who I am.
You mentioned being part of the coal community, I'll say it like that, and your mother's ecumenicalism. So I wonder if you can kind of think about those two influences in your life and how they shaped you over the years.
You know, it's interesting. Some of this came together for me literally in the midst of my pastoral installation as I was preparing myself to make remarks and realizing how much I was both of my parents' daughter. The church part was more obvious. My dad certainly went to church, was a committed part of our congregation. It was his brother who was our pastor growing up, and then his brother-in-law, his sister's husband. It's the Callahan side. The Callahans are preachers. At one point, I tried to count all of my first cousins who are preachers, and I couldn't even come up with the whole number. I mean, I can't count them all. It's so many of them. I always thought that I got the church person part from my mother, who was the church secretary, missionary president. That part was obvious. But as I literally was sitting in my installation, was thinking about my parents, I realized that my sense of justice and activism I got from my dad, who not only was his union president for many, many years until his retirement, continued to stay active even after retirement, was part of a coalition of people who brought a health clinic to our community, and he was the president of that board until his health didn't allow him to do that. He was a community activist, leader. And so I realized that both of my parents gave me a sense, my mother gave me a sense of goodness, like how do you live in the world in a way that's helpful to people and that's meaningful and kind? She was deeply beloved. I have said that she was one of the most loving people I have ever met, genuinely. She never met a stranger. I don't have all of that part of her character, but the longing to have and to be deeply decent and kind in the world, I certainly think I learned from her and my dad. I think constitutionally I'm more like him. He wasn't the huggy, outgoing person in that way, but he always was trying to figure out how to make our community better. And so I have both of them are a part of me. I was raised in a particular way, and I was raised in a particular kind of community where the commitment to community and to decency and to kindness and to God and to faith, I didn't see that as odd. That was a part of how I grew up, not only in my immediate family, but in my extended family and in the community as well. So what I'll say about my mother as an ecumenical figure is that she was absolutely Pentecostal. She hadn't been raised Pentecostal, but she was Pentecostal, and she was Pentecostal everywhere. And so I have memories of her embarrassing me at other people's churches. But again, with more age and experience, and as I come into my own kind of identity and try to be myself everywhere I am as well, I appreciate that she was always herself. That's not a small thing. That's a wonderful legacy. To live without artifice, to live openly, to live vulnerably, and always be yourself. And so I'm sure now I embarrass my daughter for the ways that I am trying to always be myself too. Again, I think I've always thought of myself more as a Callahan woman. I'm much more made like my father's sisters, who were more stoic and less expressive. But the Callahans were faithful, consistent, stable people. I have often said about my dad, you could set your watch by him. He was that consistent. Our family was that way. The community was that way. I feel like I was raised by lots of people and in a community where that was the expectation. People worked really hard. Most of the people I knew, most of the men in my family and in our community mined coal. Many of them, like my dad, for 40 plus years. The only time I recall my dad not going to work was when he was injured in the mines or was going to the Union Convention. We lived in a community where people worked really hard and looked out for each other and tried to be decent.
So how did that community contribute to or even shape you as you begin to explore your call to ministry?
So I have a kind of odd experience in that I don't know a version of me that wasn't a preacher.
Okay.
As soon as I knew I was a self, I knew I was a preacher. As a toddler, 3 years old, 4 years old, I have early memories, and my family talks about how we would go to church, particularly when we had revivals, and women would preach the revivals because as I've said, my earliest pastors were my uncles, who were men, of course. And I would go to church, and then I would come home, and I would preach my own version of what I heard. I can remember using the end table as a pulpit. My dad called me Reverend as a nickname when I was a little kid. So both internally, I was always interested in what preachers were doing. how they comported themselves, what they said about what they were doing. I was always practicing. And my call was affirmed in what, I guess I would have said at one point in my life that they were subtle ways, but now, being called reverend is not that subtle. My call was being affirmed in the community, but I was rounding up the kids in the neighborhood to play church. You play house, but if you are church people, people go to work, yep. People go to church. Going to church was like eating dinner. Mm-hmm. So we played church. I was the preacher usually. Early in life, I was probably 7 or 8, my cousins whose grandparents lived in our neighborhood would come to West Virginia for the summer, and we would do what children do, which is of course to play. And we'd ride our bikes. Our bikes were cars. I had a kitchen that I had been given for Christmas. We'd cook. We'd play church. And we actually alternated a little bit being the preacher, but I was often the preacher. I've already said that I come from a family of preachers, and so I wasn't the only one. I'm not the only one, even of that group of kids who were playing, who's now a pastor. But I was often the preacher, and once we were playing, and lots of church kids have the story about how you're playing church and then you're sort of not playing, and then you really aren't playing anymore, like your church play is turned mm-hmm. into worship. Mm-hmm. And so after my cousin went to her grandmother and said, "No, Leslie's really preaching the word of God." And so some years ago, not that long ago, 4 or 5 years ago, we were together. That cousin came to my 10th pastoral anniversary and sort of chuckled and said, "This was completely predictable." I had a lot of affirmation, I think, for my call and gifts as a preacher, as a very young child, as a very young person. And at the same time, a real sense that the call was mine. Like, I never had the sense that this was something other people were imposing on me. It always felt to me like God and I had a secret that kind of everybody else knew too, right? But I never felt a sense of imposition. It was a self I knew. And I was appreciative. I think I've heard lots of stories from people whose calls weren't affirmed in community in that way, whose calls were denied, objected to. And I can only imagine the kind of pain, because even in my life, as I've journeyed, through my sense of call, as a toddler, as a child, as a teenager, coming to the point where I needed to express the seriousness of my call, to say out loud, "This is who I am. This is what God has called me to do." Then the sense of a call to pastoral ministry. At every turn, there's been the opportunity and the danger that people would not receive the call, that people would not embrace it. I've always known that a call is not just internal, that a call has to be affirmed by the community. It's helpful if your call can be affirmed by the people who are closest to you. And so at every turn, as I have as I've journeyed and felt guided in the various stages of my call, there's always the danger that people will say no, that I'm aware of, that didn't happen for me. People haven't said no. As I have felt led, I have been affirmed. But that's not everybody's story. And there's a sense of vulnerability as you're being led, or as I was being led, there was a sense of vulnerability. What if people don't believe? What if people don't receive? What if I never get a call? What if I never get to do this thing that I feel like I'm supposed to do? And on any given Sunday, what if I don't deliver, right? Like, this doesn't work just internally. It has to be affirmed. Even now, as a pastor, I preach as a pastor, which is different than preaching as an evangelist or as an itinerant in some way. Preaching that shapes a community, you hope, is different. And as I feel and sense direction within the preaching itself and also for the community, I remain aware that it's possible that the direction I sense, the word I have, still needs affirmation, still needs to be recognizable to the people of the St. Paul's Baptist Church as the Word of God, the will of God, still has to be affirmed. I have my own sense of affirmation. I have my own sense of direction. But that has to connect with the sense of affirmation that's internal to people who are hearing, to the community itself. And at every turn, even 15 years in, there's a great possibility that people will be like, okay, that was far enough, but not here. Mm-hmm. So I have been blessed. I recognize it as a blessing to have had both a very strong, I think you have to have both, right? I have had a very strong internal witness, a very strong sense of call. And I mean that kind of at the larger level of what am I to do with my life. Yeah. But also on the week-to-week level, like what am I supposed to be saying this week? Like there's something pretty much all the time that's like this way. I have that, and I've also had the blessing of the affirmation of the hearer, the affirmation of the community, eventually, not immediately always, right? But eventually, there's been a place where I have been able to exercise my gifts and where somebody else has said, yes, we see this in you too. And that's been true all along.
It's a beautiful story of affirmation. It really is. Yeah.
I'm thankful.
Yeah, it's just a beautiful story. I'll say that. I want to explore a little bit. I think before you were pastoring is when you were in the academy. Is that a correct
That's
statement?
correct.
Okay. So can you talk a little bit about your time in the academy and then this transition to full-time pastorate?
Sure. I think this starts early on as well. I was always academically affirmed too. It was the academy was a place of school was a place that I felt a lot of affirmation. I always did well, and I liked learning. I love learning. I'm interested in knowing things, especially the things I'm interested in. Right. So I always had a lot of affirmation. when I went to seminary, and to some extent probably in my personal statement for my PhD work too, I talked about thinking and encouraging other people to think as a call. I understand in some measure my vocation in the church to be about thinking too. As an undergraduate, I was a religion major because that was the thing I was most interested in. I had the kind of crises intellectually and spiritually that often come when you realize that the world you thought, that what you were taught, no longer explains things. You know, some people approach being religion majors as I'm going to get through these hoops and then I'm going to go back to thinking the way I thought before I started. For a lot of reasons, not least of which that I have really, again, out of this place of decency, like I've really tried to be a person of integrity, and I've tried to be a consistent person throughout, internally. And so at the point where I was persuaded that this makes more sense than what I had originally been taught, I couldn't just go back. So that created all kinds of crises. That's not unheard of, right? That's, I think, fairly typical for people. So I'm in the midst of these crises of faith, and I have this thought as an undergraduate religious studies major, it would really be good if I knew that some of these professors were faithful people, that they had found a way through it. Around that same time, I had my first Black woman professor. I took a course on Black women's spiritual writings at Harvard Divinity School. And there was a visiting professor there, Frances Smith Foster. And all of a sudden I thought, oh, I could get a PhD. Like, it's that combination of thinking, it would be nice if some of these folks in this religious studies department seemed like faithful people. I now know that some of them were, I just couldn't see it. Yeah. But I saw it as a thing, right? And at that same time, I encounter a Black woman who has a PhD, whose presence and also encouragement says, you know, you could be a Black woman with a PhD. So the combination of trying to work out these theological issues that had arisen in my studies and thinking, I think maybe I want to go get a PhD, sent me to Union Seminary. My project at Union Seminary was to work out what I thought so that I could be a person who could help both congregations and also in the academy to bring these things together, religion and religious studies. So I went to Union. I think it was pretty clear to me, even during my time at Union, that I was a pastor. But it's also pretty clear to me that there was no way in a search call process I was going to get a church at 25. And the door to get a PhD opened. And so I started my doctoral studies. I wanted to think about Pentecostalism, which was my tradition. I wanted to take it seriously as a thought world, as a place for intellectual inquiry. So this is 1996. This goes without saying in a way now that it didn't go without saying in 1996.
Sure.
So I wanted to do that work. I wanted to give something to the community that had shaped and formed me. And I wanted to think about, I think in retrospect, I wasn't probably as aware of that then as I am now, but I also really wanted to think, I wanted to make some sense of my own experience too. So I started the doctoral program at Princeton and immediately started working on the staff of a church. this is, so I think maybe I was in the middle of my second year of coursework when the pastor of the church where I was, who was pregnant, had preterm labor and had to go on bed rest. And then I got to play pastor. I remember when I did my first funeral, I was like, this is what I was born for. And so, you know, I worked at the church. I really loved that. And then in the middle of my fourth year, at the end of my funding, which is key, the middle of my fourth year, there's conflict in the church and the senior pastor leaves. And that situation kind of blows up for me because I know I can't stay. And here I am at the end of my funding.
Yes.
And I think, okay, now what am I going to do? I'm disaffected with the church because the church thing was not working out great at that moment. And I've been churching instead of PhDing. And to their everlasting credit, I will always credit my faculty leaders in the institution where I was at Princeton University. Because the second I said, you know what, I think I want to finish, it's like they had been waiting for me to decide I was going to finish. In ways that are inconceivable. I don't even understand why. This is part of my beautiful story, I think, too. What the saints would call testimony. My testimony is about the faithfulness of God and the favor of people who really helped me. They could have been mad at me. That would have been legitimate. It would have been understandable. But they weren't. They just were helpful. And I realized that there was no way through but through. I don't have quit in me. I probably should have quit, but I don't really have it. I don't know how to quit. That's the truth. I don't know how to quit. And so I was like, well, let's finish. And they were so helpful. And here again, they were so helpful. They helped me to finish. I think I had a couple of exams left. And I put my head down because I had to. Yeah. I'm like, this is what it takes to finish, let's go. But they helped me. So I finished my exams. As soon as I finished my exams, they knew I was out of money. They helped me get kind of adjunct gigs so that I started to teach and write. And at the end of it all, I finished my PhD in 6 years. After really I was way behind at the end of 4, but I finished. And I got good jobs, which I also thought of as extraordinary blessing and favor. And so I moved to Philadelphia and I started to teach, but I knew I was a pastor. So after my 3rd year review, I got a semester sabbatical and I took a church.
All right.
Yeah, I took an interim. Mm-hmm. And I took the interim, another story of extraordinary blessing and favor, but I took the interim. So the blessing and favor part is literally the executive minister was doing a thing where he wanted to visit all of the ministers in the region, the American Baptist Churches, the Philadelphia Baptist Association. And he decided he was going to come see me first. He met me at my office at the University of Pennsylvania. And I said to him, I'm not really getting to preach a lot. I put my name on the pulpit supply list. I'm not getting called a lot. Is there a church that might need an interim so that I can preach? This is my third year. And he said, there is a church. Send me your resume. So I get called to this church. At the end of my third year, I have the sabbatical semester, which if you have funding, you can turn it into a year. So I had this church gig. So I was like, I want a year. And when I came back, I said, I'm done. Yeah. I'm like, I have to eat. I don't have a call. So I'd like to finish my contract and search for a call. I'm a pastor. And it's funny, my dean at the time, the dean of the college at the time had been my department chair when I came into the religious studies department. And she said, we knew this was a possibility. I had never hidden that I thought I was a pastor. Mm-hmm. Literally, so you have a job talk and they take you out to dinner afterwards and they say, tell us about you. And I'm like, I want to be a pastor. Like, I didn't have any better sense at a job talk than to tell him I wanted a different job. So I had always been, I hadn't been opaque about it. I had been very clear, both internally, I guess that's the theme here, right? Like the internal and the external. Internally, I knew who I was, and externally, I just waited for the moment. But I was never unclear internally. And I was thankful. I had a good academic job. It was a department I liked. It was colleagues I liked. What I'm grateful for is that I got to leave academia having seen its best. It just wasn't me. Like I had people, especially junior faculty, flee screaming from places because the senior faculty or mistreat them or they're overloaded with committee assignments. I didn't have any of that. I had a reasonable teaching load. I had research money. I had a department that was small where I was well treated and people who I still like. I was just a pastor. And so I told them, I came back at the point where if I was going to stay, I was going to need to put my head down again for the tenure process. Mm-hmm. And I said, I'm not doing that. So I said, I'm going to hang out, finish out my contract because I have to eat. But my mind had already turned. And not long after that, I had an opportunity to teach at New York Theological Seminary, which I would have been able to do and pastor. But at the end of my first year at NYTS, I got called to St. Paul's. I taught one more year and then decided I wanted all of my life to be in the same city. That the commute, I think, was more, I think there were a couple of things going on. I know there were a couple of things going on. Let's say it this way. There were a couple of things going on. One is I also knew I wanted to be a parent, and I didn't want to be commuting from Philadelphia to New York trying to figure out how to pick up my kid if they were sick. And so I wanted my life to be all in one place. And I was in a church where I could be full-time at the church, which is another space of privilege. Yeah. And so at the end of my first year of pastoring, I told NYTS that I would teach one more year, but that I wasn't, that then I would go into the full-time pastorate. People ask me about this all the time. What happened? Tell us, And the thing I think that's the truest thing is that while I liked academia, I did not love it. And to have so clear a love as the one I have for the church, in contrast to just liking the academy. That doesn't mean there aren't things I miss about it. I miss going to conferences and hearing papers that make me think more deeply about a topic. The intellectual work of the church is different than the intellectual work of the academy. So I love it when I get to talk to colleagues about things that they're thinking about, that stir up that way of thinking deeply about a subject. But when it came right down to it, I didn't love faculty meetings.
You're not alone.
I wanted to have a chance. I thought that in pastoral ministry, I could see whether the vision that I had for what church could be, whether we really could be that. Whether we could be progressive insofar as our social and political and theological perspective was, and at the same time have a sense of and experience of and belief in God as God. Like that, what I believe still that it's possible, because this is what I experience. I experience that God is God. And my journey has been about how I interpret my journey, how I look back over my life, is the way that God has shown up so huge. So on the one hand, I've put it this way to friends, on the one hand, I believe in the completely rational and logical, and on the other hand, I believe in the completely magical and miraculous. And I'm always walking around believing in both of these things at the same time. And so part of what I have tried to do as a pastor is to live into that and see if I could lead us in a way that continues to nurture a real spirituality, a real sense of God's presence, and also a more complex reading of the Bible, a more progressive reading of social life and politics. So that's my project. So thinking and praying and experiencing and mediating a sense of God's realness, kind of all at the same time, has been. And I started with, I said I feel called to think and to help other people to think. That's part of it. It's also to feel and to call other people to feel, and to sort of make room for the experience part. That's so much a part of me as a Pentecostal.
You've said a lot, and as you're talking, I'm thinking about the consistency of your inner witness and the external affirmation, if you will, even in the your thinking. I hear that part of it. So I wonder, what would you say to people who are struggling with that, this either struggling with the internal witness, and I'm thinking of, like, especially young women who, or women, I don't want to say young women who, they struggle, can this be God, is this God, that kind of, so I wonder if you can just kind of talk about that a little bit.
I know that there are people who don't believe God calls women. Like, that's an intellectual knowing, right? Like, yeah. I mean, I know that such an animal exists, right? I know that there are people who don't believe it, and I know that there are people who've been formed in spaces where they then hear the call themselves and they have difficulty believing it themselves, which is this inner witness part. Like, they're like, I think God is calling me, but God couldn't be calling me. Now, let me say, there are points in every journey where we encounter a thing that feels too hard for us, even when we know nothing is too hard for God. I have those stories too. I have those moments where I'm like, do I have the stuff for what this moment takes? I've had many of those moments as a pastor over 15 years. So I think uncertainty and wrestling, I mean, it's a trope of call narratives, right? Like you say, no, God, it couldn't possibly be me. Everybody has those moments, which is why this interaction between the external and internal to me is so important, because sometimes, as they used to sing when I was growing up, sometimes it's something down inside of me telling me, go ahead. Sometimes it's somebody over there who's saying, go ahead.
Yeah.
So when I talk to women who are in traditions or been shaped in places, what I would say to them is, what exactly is it that you think God is calling you to do? And why would the devil want you to do that? Like, whose project would it be for you to proclaim the good news of life in Jesus Christ other than God's? By the same token, you know, as a Black feminist and womanist, I learned to do power analyses. By the same token, the people who are saying no to your call, what's their interest in saying no? What do they get? That part is really very clear. Often for men, it is the power and the way that power operates when you're the only one who has it.
Yeah.
Often for women in those traditions, sometimes older women or just other women, it's a sense of, but if women could do this, why couldn't I? So when you start to do a little thinking, right? That's a good place for some thinking. Yeah. Whose interest does it serve to keep you out of this thing that you feel called to, that you feel drawn to? And in this way, I'm like the old preachers. I mean, if you cannot do it, don't. There's plenty of trouble in this work. There's plenty of heartache in ministry. If you can push the call off, do it as long as you can. But tell yourself the truth. Tell yourself the truth. And when you know a truth, tell other people it. And I do believe that God will send people into your life, into a person's life, that to help them to come to the fullness of their call. And what I say to people who feel like they're past the prime of that is, but you're still here. And there can be a version of the fullness of your call wherever, at whatever stage of life you are in.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And so stop fighting other people's calls and live in yours. Because it can make you bitter if you don't live into your call, and then you see somebody else doing a thing that you thought you could, that in your heart you wish you could do. You wish you could have done.
Yeah.
So I think in that moment, rather than being bitter, ask God what you can do now. So yeah, I think, I recognize I'm not, and I try to be a person who is affirming of other people's calls, because I recognize that not every space is safe for that. That's a project of mine, is to be affirming, to try to see people's calls, to try to hear them, and to be a space of external affirmation. I served a couple of terms on the Commission on Ministry for our region. And one of my favorite things about that commission is that people would come before us seeking ordination. And it was all kinds of people. American Baptist churches can be very diverse in terms of what one congregation is versus what another congregation is, or how they operate. And so we saw lots of different sorts of people come before the commission. And one of my favorite things about it was every time there would be some moment where something would happen in the conversation where I would feel a deep sense of affirmation for our candidate. Aha, indeed God has called you. Yeah. And I love those moments. I love the moments where I get to affirm other people's call. And I think it's in that context that I started to think very specifically and deeply about what it means not just to be called yourself, but to have it affirmed by the community. You have to have that. And you also have to have some accountability internally and some accountability to the community. Like, what does it mean to be called, I would say, to ordained people? My question almost always was, what does it mean to be called to the church as an institution? You got some responsibilities. The church is not just the people of God. The church also is an institution. How will you exercise your ministry? And being ordained into a denomination is really about making a commitment, not just to God, not just to the church that ordains you, but also to the church as an institution. How will you be a steward? How will you be a holder, a caregiver for the reality of the institution that is church in a time of anti-institutionalism? Like, have you given some thought to what it means to show up to be ordained? So there's the internal witness, the external affirmation, and then there's that process of coming to accountability, consciousness of the accountability we have to these institutions. Even if what that means is that we're accountable to try to transition them into the 21st century. Like, I don't mean take them wholesale or unmoved, but you also can't blow them. I don't think one can, with integrity, just blow them off either. So it's all these things kind of working together. Us and God and us more broadly. So I try to be, as I interact with other people, particularly women, particularly young women, I try to be conscious of all of that as I try to hear people's call and try to affirm them. And I occasionally get the privilege of helping to guide people. And then I think the institution needs to be accountable back, too, right? We have to stop making people go for 3 years of seminary and all this academic debt into churches that will never be able to pay them enough.
My.
So the accountability, like, all these things are mutual.
Yeah.
There has to be some mutuality around this. Like, you cannot expect your candidates to engage in a process that depletes them, and you have no intention of offering them anything back. All of it's mutual. All of it should be mutual. All of it should be mutual. And this is the thing, I mean, when I say I'm trying to figure out, can you do this the way I'm thinking it ought to be done? I'm not entirely sure. But that's the question. That's my.
It's a good project.
That's my project.
Yeah.
How do I think this ought to go? What would this look like whole? How could we honor God? How could we honor individual people? How could we honor the community? How could we honor the institution? How could we live in mutuality and health with all of these? How could we think and feel and honor tradition and be innovative? And how do we do all this at the same time? And what might it look like? And I keep thinking that we won't get it all done, probably, because I'm a realist. But I keep thinking that the closer we get to it, that there's something really beautiful that's possible. That the trying is beautiful. And my life is filled with, I'm filled with wonder at where this quest has taken me so far.
So let's talk a little bit about your preaching journey, which is intertwined with your pastoral journey. So however you want to answer with both of those in mind. So tell me about maybe one of your best preaching moments.
Okay, I've got a couple. One of my best preaching moments, November 2008, Reign of Christ Sunday. I was a lectionary preacher. I've been a lectionary preacher since seminary. Have come to really appreciate the liturgical year and the way it kind of grounds the journey of congregations and my own journey. Even when I was in more itinerant ministry, I still generally preached the Revised Common Lectionary, one of the texts therein. And there are a few Sundays that I've come to really love. I really love Palm Sunday. I really love the Sunday after Easter, Pentecost, and the Reign of Christ Sunday, the whole season of Advent. But those specific Sundays I really love. I was in the search process with the St. Paul's Baptist Church, and we were at the phase where they asked, when are you preaching, like neutral pulpit kind of questions, right? So that the search committee can come hear you live. Mm-hmm. And my home church at that time, I can't remember now whether I said to my pastor, I need to preach somewhere so they can come hear me, or whether he had already invited me to preach the Reign of Christ Sunday, Christ the King. In any case, November 2008, I preached at Mount Carmel, and I preached a sermon called What Kind of King? From Matthew 25, which was the lectionary, the gospel that year. And what was extraordinary about it, I didn't know that the search committee was there. I had several dates in the area, and so I didn't know which one they were coming to. I didn't know that they were there. Mount Carmel was always a wonderful place to preach. The pastor then was an extraordinary preacher, is an extraordinary preacher, and it was always a wonderful place to preach. But this Sunday was something special. And so I preached this sermon, and when I sat down, it was like something fell on the room. I mean, it was extraordinary. It wasn't during the preaching, it was right after. They used to have offering after the preaching, and it just took a while to get to the offering. Nobody was singing. I don't even know how to explain it, but it was really extraordinary. And I heard later from the search committee, I heard about the search committee members who were there, that they went back to the search committee and said, I think we just heard our pastor.
Wow.
And the members of the committee who hadn't been able to go that day, like they were just like, but it was an extraordinary moment for me too. Like that was one, and of course in retrospect to know that like that was probably when I actually became the pastor of St. Paul's. More recently, I had the opportunity to preach on April 4th from the balcony of the Lorraine Motel for the King commemoration. That was another really extraordinary moment. I mean, I had been to the museum before, but it's a mystical place. It's one of those places, as one of my friends describes it, where the veil is thin between. And standing on that balcony on April 4th, Jesse Jackson was there. He was on the balcony too while I was preaching, standing with the room that King had stepped out of, standing more or less in the place where he fell, was amazing. And there was a kind of, I say, sometimes when I'm preaching, I feel like I'm flying. Sometimes I feel like I'm preaching, but sometimes I feel like I'm flying. And that was a day, it wasn't the same as like, sometimes at St. Paul's, I feel like I'm flying. It wasn't that, it was much more weighty. But it was extraordinary. That was an extraordinary moment. The moment itself was so weighty. And the preaching caught the air, if that makes sense, where the preaching itself caught the air. And so it was this weird experience of both feeling the like enormous weight of being there in that moment, and also feeling like the preaching, the sermon itself was taking off. So it wasn't so much me flying that day, because I felt the weight. That's two examples of where memorable. I mean, I've preached places that were memorable where I was like, wow, I can't believe I'm here. My first sermon as pastor of St. Paul's was pretty extraordinary. My candidacy sermon. And then last Sunday, to mark the anniversary, I preached it again. I preached my candidacy sermon. Except as I was listening to the candidacy sermon, trying to remember what I had said, I heard something different. And so it had a different spin. I heard something else, and so I preached the new thing, but more or less the structure of the sermon was the same. And I've had memorable moments after big life transitions. I often, because preaching is so much a part of my identity, when I'm going through big life transitions, I think, how will I preach? Will I be able to preach after this? Like how will this change my preaching? So I've had some of those moments too.
Right, so I want to ask on the other side, can you name a moment that was most difficult for you?
I don't know that I have as poignant a moment.
Okay.
It's funny. I mean, I'm somebody who, I've had some difficult funerals, for example, at St. Paul's. But when I stand to preach, things calm down. So the funeral itself was difficult, but not so much the preaching part. The most difficult moments I've had in preaching, I think generally speaking, are in moments where what I need to say and what I want to say are not the same. So when I'm struggling in the preparation, I am learning. It's not a completed lesson, but I am learning to say, what are you trying not to say that's before you?
That's good.
Because I don't find preaching difficult, generally speaking. I don't find it easy either, but I don't find it difficult. When I'm struggling and I'm like, I have nothing, it's usually because I just don't want to say whatever is before me. I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to delve in. That's when it's difficult. I've had, I just thought of another memorable preaching experience. When I was in Princeton, we used to do a revival with another church. First Baptist Princeton and First Baptist Lincoln Gardens used to do a revival together. At first, it was the senior pastors who did the revival, and Buster Soaries was pastoring Lincoln Gardens, Felicia Thomas was pastoring First Baptist. But this one year, they decided, this I think was the last year, this one year they decided the associates would do the revival. So we did 6 nights. We did Palm Sunday through Good Friday. And I had Good Friday. This particular year, they had the first half, we had the second half. And so I had Good Friday. And that year I had decided that I was gonna do, this was before social media, but I decided I was gonna do a media fast, no television, which was very difficult, no television. And I'm trying to remember, maybe I said I wasn't gonna read for pleasure. I was just going to be silent for Holy Week. It was awful. It felt like being put through the paces of Holy Week, like it felt like I was experiencing Holy Week. And then I had this extraordinary experience where every day I would get a line for the sermon. The most memorable line was the beginning of the sermon. There's a time for Jesus to shut up and die. And so I had shut up and die in my head like all week. It was another one that was it was a flying. When I finally got to the actual sermon, it was a flying, I was flying. But the week was really brutal because I didn't have anything to distract me. And so I'm just sitting.
That's rich though.
I'm sitting with Jesus having to die and thinking about how he kind of gets quiet. Like he's done all. And the gist of it is about how at some point you've done all you can do. He knows the disciples don't have it. They don't have it. But he can't stay to give it to them. More talking is not going to do it. So anyway, so it was very hard. I'm an extrovert. I don't like the quiet. I talk out loud to myself. The quiet was just, and it did feel like it was it felt like it was about me. And I guess in retrospect, it was about my own journey. It was time to, are you doing this PhD or are you not? There's no more talking about the PhD. You don't finish unless you put your head down and do it. Nobody else can do it for you. So I feel like there have been lots of moments like that where you just get to a point where it's like, there's no more talking about this, do it. For Jesus, it was dying, not the easiest thing, to be sure. And I talk about that in the sermon. I'm like, it goes against his nature. Both natures. God doesn't die, and people don't want to. So anyway, but when preaching is difficult, it's usually because there's something I don't want to say.
That's good. Yeah.
Or I quit on a sermon. There've been a time or two. This doesn't usually happen.
Okay.
I don't have a lot of like, I just flunked. Like I have sermons where I thought, And the beauty of pastoral preaching is I can try again.
You get to try again, right?
Let me try this again. Let me see if I can get at this again. Yeah. So I don't have a lot of terrible flunk. I mean, I practiced a lot before I started preaching in front of people. Mm-hmm. So I don't have the stories of, when I first started preaching, I was terrible, which some people have. I don't have that story. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily preach those sermons now. It was a long time ago, but some of my thinking about things has changed. But I had practiced telling the story. I used to record myself, listen back, critique myself. I preached in the mirror. When I was a high school student, I would come home after school and I would do that thing where you just open a passage and it's like, okay, preach that and see what I could make of it. So I didn't have a lot of I had been preaching for a very long time before anybody else ever heard me, other than the kids on the block. So I don't have a lot of those stories, but I have had moments where, back to this thing about the internal, external, where internally I thought, this is not connecting. I'm not somebody who needs people to yell back at me while I'm preaching. I don't mean that. I don't mean can I get an amen or a witness or anything like that. That's not really my vibe. But where I just felt like I'm not getting this out. This is not working. And one time, I just abandoned it. I found an exit, which is not a bad strategy. But somebody in the congregation later said, it feels like you just quit on that sermon. I'm like, because I feel like I did. And he was like, but I don't know why. So that was a time when kind of what it felt like inside and what was going on outside were really not in the same place. So yeah, I've had some of those moments. Or by contrast, a sermon I really liked that I thought was a well put together sermon that the people at church were like, that was fine. I'm like, but no, don't you see this homiletical genius that's happening in this sermon? Right. Do you see, I've tied all, I started here and I ended here and I crossed them up and I put it together so nicely. They don't care about any of that. They don't care about any of that. Yeah. None of it. Yeah. And so I'm like, oh, well, So I've had more of that. I don't believe in bad preaching, though. I don't see a reason for it. Tell the story. The story itself is great. Yeah. And so if you don't get in the way of it, there's a bottom that your preaching ever can be if you don't get in the way of telling the story.
Well, that's a mouthful right there. Don't get in the way.
Don't get in the way. Try to and I don't mean hide me behind the cross. I don't mean that kind of don't get in the way. Right. I mean, because I think God wants us to be present in our preaching. What kind of sense would it make for God to call me and not want me to be present? God chooses God's vessels. I mean more like what I was talking about before, where I don't want to say the thing that's kind of the thing that needs to be said. Yeah. That's me getting in the way. I think the implications of, sometimes we don't want to express what we think the implications of the story are in the sense of freedom for all of the captives. We don't want to say things that make church people mad. Yeah. Because the institution can sometimes want to bind people. And then here we come, it's time to preach, and the word is a word of freedom for some of the people that our churches want bound. Dismissed, silenced. So then you have to decide whether you're going to get in the way of the gospel. Yeah. Or whether you're going to let fly and see what happens.
Yeah. Well, our time is well spent. I want to ask just one final question. Okay. Final question, as you think about legacy, What do you hope at this stage of life? I trust that you've got many more years to come.
I pray so.
Yes. So, but at this stage of life, if you were to give some thought to legacy, what would you hope that your preaching and or pastoral legacy to be? If we could just mark this moment.
I would want the children who grow up at St. Paul's to believe and to know that God is real, that there's nothing impossible with God, and that they are deeply and thoroughly loved as themselves. That's what I want. And I want everybody I run into to have, insofar as I get to make some contribution to their life, what I'd like them to leave with is a sense that God is real, that there's nothing impossible with God, and that they are deeply loved, that God loves them as themselves. I feel like that's what I got from that's what my journey has taught me. In the coal fields of West Virginia, they made me believe that if God and I decided a thing, it was a thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I would hope. I hope that for the children who grow up at St. Paul's. I hope they never have one moment where they wonder about any of the above. And that if they wonder about any of the above, that there will be a kind of North Star of what they got at St. Paul's that reminds them of the truth of that.
It has been my pleasure to spend this time with pastor of St. Paul's Baptist Church, Reverend Dr. Leslie Callahan. Thank you for joining us again for another installation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we invite you to come back again when we will have additional installations of the Legacy Preaching Series.